before Rome built its colosseums, before Alexander swept across continents with fire in his eyes, before Europe ever tasted the idea of imperial might, there was Persia, an empire forged not just by war, but by vision. In the vast stretches of scorched earth and shadowed mountains between the Aegean Sea and the Indus Valley, a people rose from obscurity and stitched together a realm that dared to unite the known world. Of a king who carved his name into cliffs to declare justice, a villain in Greek tales, a shadow cast by Alexander's flame. But the truth, like the empire itself, is far more layered. Grand, mysterious, often misunderstood. This is not a history lesson. This is a journey into a forgotten heartbeat of humanity. A pulse that once thundered across 3 continents. Of armies that crossed deserts and built floating bridges across seas. It's a story of ambition, betrayal, mercy, madness, and dreams too large for their time. Not through blind conquest alone, but through policy, tolerance, and the power of an idea, that order could rise from chaos, and kings could rule without erasing the cultures they conquered. This is not the story of just battles and borders. It's the story of a shepherd boy who would become a liberator. Let's walk through the dust of ancient roads, past golden halls, and burning cities, through the rise, glory, and fall of one of the greatest empires the world has ever known. Welcome to Persia. History often remembers Persia in fragments. So, let's begin. Long before the Persian Empire carved its place into the map of history, the lands it would one day rule were already steeped in ancient power. Civilizations had come and gone like waves crashing and retreating over time. To the west, the mighty rivers of Mesopotamia cradled humanity's earliest cities. Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, names that echoed with invention, warfare, and worship. To the east, the Elamites stood watch, fierce and enigmatic, their temples rising in what is now southwestern Iran. And it would rise from the rocks of Pars, and above them all, like a storm always gathering on the horizon, loomed the Assyrian Empire, ruthless, efficient, and feared. Their iron-fisted reign stretched over kingdoms like a tightening net, until they too crumbled beneath the weight of their ambition. By the 7th century BC, another force had emerged from the highlands, the Medes. Hill people at first, the Medes had grown strong, united under kings, and had helped bring the Assyrian colossus to its knees. Just a scattered people, pastoral and proud, living in the sunburnt lands of Pars, known today as Fars province in Iran. Not in cities or palaces, but in tents and tribal councils, where loyalty and leadership were earned, not inherited. And though the Medes held the leash, the fire of something greater simmered quietly beneath the surface. The terrain was unforgiving, stitched together with rocky outcrops, deep valleys, and dry, blistering plains that cracked beneath the midday heat. It was a land that tested your resolve. But it was also a land that taught resilience. It grew warriors, not courtiers, dreamers, not inheritors, men who stared down mountains and thought of climbing them. In the aftermath, they extended their influence far and wide, ruling over the fractured lands like seasoned architects of empire. And among the many tribes under their watch, tucked away in the rugged south, were the Persians. The Persians were not yet an empire, not yet anything, really. Here, in this cradle of dust and stone, the soul of Persia began to stir. No one knew it, yet not the Babylonians in their temples, not the Egyptians in their painted tombs, not even the Medes sitting confidently on their thrones, but change was coming. He was not born into power, he was born into prophecy. In the twilight between myth and memory, the story of Cyrus begins in the hills of Anshan, where the wind howled through crags like an ancient song. His grandfather was Astyages, king of the Medes. But power and family rarely made good neighbors in ancient times. Of his bearing, his wisdom, his unnatural favor with those around him. When he was eventually restored to his birthright, it wasn't power he sought, it was purpose. One version of the tale, preserved by Herodotus and colored by centuries of storytelling, tells us that Astyages dreamed of his grandson overthrowing him. The general leading the Median forces, Harpagus, was the very man whom Astyages had once ordered to kill the infant Cyrus. And Cyrus was just getting started. History, it seems, has a wicked sense of irony. Harpagus defected. Astyages fell. At Thymbra, he unleashed a strategy still studied in military academies today. Using camels to frighten the Lydian cavalry, who were unfamiliar with the scent, he broke their lines. Croesus retreated to his capital, Sardis, only to find it surrounded within days. The mighty city fell, and Cyrus, once again, did not destroy. He welcomed, he listened. Even Croesus, once his enemy, became an advisor. To Cyrus, power wasn't in crushing others, it was in turning rivals into allies. It is said that Croesus asked the oracle of Delphi if he should go to war with Cyrus. He didn't build towering statues of himself. He didn't rename cities after his glory. Instead, he led with a quiet, enduring strength, the kind that doesn't shout but echoes. Others claim he died fighting bravely to the end. But what matters is not how he died, it's what he left behind. The reply was ambiguous. If you cross the river, a great empire will fall. He took that as a green light. But he misunderstood. It would be his empire that collapsed. He began as a shepherd, raised in exile. And he became the father of one of history's greatest empires. And in that moment, Media did not burn. There was no mass slaughter, no reckless vengeance. He entered it almost without resistance. The people, disillusioned with their own king Nabonidus, opened the gates. Cyrus walked in not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. Instead, Persia absorbed Media, and in doing so, set a precedent that would define its empire: rule through respect. In fear, he ordered the boy's death. But fate, as it often does with great men, had other plans. It was ancient even then. Towering ziggurats, walls thick enough to race chariots across, temples that reached for heaven. To conquer, it would be to claim not just land, but a legend. He was a tactician, a speaker, and more importantly, a unifier. He didn't command loyalty, he inspired it. Tribe after tribe rallied to his cause, not because they feared him, but because they believed him. The infant Cyrus was saved, raised by a shepherd and his wife, far from the palace's cold ambition. He restored local gods to their temples, released captive peoples to return home, including the Jews, who would later write of him in their scriptures as the Anointed One. In a world used to kings who ruled with fear, here was one who ruled with principle. Where other rulers enforced religion, Cyrus protected it. Where others enslaved, he released. There, in the quiet of the highlands, the boy learned what no palace walls could teach: humility, hunger, patience. While other sons of kings were learning how to wear crowns, Cyrus was learning how to carry burdens, herding livestock under scorching sun, sleeping beneath a sky so wide it made even the mountains feel small. These early years did not weaken him, they forged him. As he grew, whispers began, of the boy with fire in his eyes. Cyrus understood something most conquerors never do. People are not just obstacles or resources. They are stories. They are soil. And if you want to build an empire that lasts, you don't just take land, you plant vision. His first challenge would be the very kingdom that had once ruled him, Media. The Median Empire had grown bloated with pride, confident in its strength. But Cyrus, now king of the small but determined Persians, was different. The war against Astyages was swift and in many ways poetic. Now the world was watching. The next great power in his path was Lydia, ruled by King Croesus, a man famous for his wealth and his arrogance. The Battle of Tyria was brutal and indecisive, but Cyrus learned, adapted, waited. But the crowning jewel of his conquests, the city that would seal his legacy, was Babylon. Babylon, the city of wonders, the heartbeat of Mesopotamia. Yet Cyrus didn't storm Babylon with fire and fury. And here is where Cyrus broke the mold forever. He stood in the great halls of Babylon and proclaimed not domination, but freedom. This philosophy, revolutionary in its time, was etched into stone in the Cyrus Cylinder, often called the First Declaration of Human Rights. His empire now stretched from the Aegean Sea to the mountains of Central Asia, yet Cyrus remained grounded. But even legends meet their final chapter. In 530 BC, while campaigning against nomadic tribes near the Jaxartes River in modern-day Kazakhstan, Cyrus fell in battle. The exact circumstances are murky. Some say he was betrayed. A legacy, an empire not just of stone and steel, but of ideas. A new way to rule. A vision of leadership that still inspires. Not by force alone, but by wisdom, restraint, and a belief that greatness begins not in how you conquer, but in how you lead. Cyrus had built the foundation. He had drawn the map. But it was up to his son to walk its edges. Cambyses too stepped into history beneath a shadow so large it swallowed nearly everything around it. He was not his father, and he knew it. Where Cyrus was calculated and visionary, Cambyses was intense, driven by a hunger to prove himself worthy of the legacy he had inherited. They faced logistical nightmares, lack of water, endless dunes, sudden sandstorms that could erase an army's trail in minutes. Still, they pressed on. His father's empire had become the largest the world had seen, and yet it still had open ends. To the west, beyond the deserts and the Nile, lay Egypt, ancient, wealthy, proud, and unconquered. He took the traditional title of pharaoh, made offerings to local gods, and respected Egyptian customs at first. But something began to shift. Whether it was the pressure of rule, grief over the recent death of his brother Berdia, or the weight of his father's looming legacy, Cambyses grew increasingly erratic. It was more than ambition that drew Cambyses toward the Nile. It was symbolism. Egypt represented the last great independent power of the ancient world, but Berdia was supposed to be dead. Cambyses had ordered his execution in secret, fearful of rivalry. Now, either a true brother had survived, or a cunning impostor had seized his name. Even the murder of members of his own family and advisors. It's hard to tell which of these stories are truth, and which are the exaggerations of hostile Greek historians, but the image that emerges is clear. Cambyses was cracking under the weight of empire. The people whispered, the satraps watched. The throne of Persia, once steady, had begun to wobble. To bring it under Persian rule would complete what Cyrus had started, a unification of civilizations across Asia and Africa. But where Cyrus had often found subtlety and diplomacy more powerful than brute strength, Cambyses would take a more direct path. What happened next became legend. Herodotus tells us that Cambyses, knowing the Egyptians revered cats as sacred, ordered his soldiers to paint cats on their shields. Somewhere near Syria, he fell, some say by accident, others by his own hand. Wounded, weakened, and humiliated, Cambyses died far from the heart of the empire he was born to rule. Some even say he released cats onto the battlefield, forcing the Egyptian archers to hesitate rather than risk harming a sacred animal. The Persian army set out in 525 BC, crossing harsh terrain and punishing climates. At the border of Egypt, near the city of Pelusium, the two great civilizations collided. Whether fact or myth, the Battle of Pelusium was a decisive Persian victory. The Egyptian forces, unprepared for the cunning and might of the Persian assault, were overwhelmed. Memphis, the capital, soon fell. The pharaoh Psamtik III was captured and paraded before his people, a ruler made small in the shadow of an empire. But conquest is only half the battle. What follows is harder: keeping the peace. Cambyses' rule in Egypt started off with some attempts at continuity. Reports from the time suggest cruelty, desecration of sacred sites, the mocking of local beliefs. Then came the news that would unravel everything. Back in Persia, a man claiming to be Berdia Cambyses' brother had taken the throne. Either way, the damage was done. Cambyses began the journey home to confront the usurper, but fate would not let him return. He left no heir, no grand monument, only questions. His Egyptian campaign had succeeded militarily, there was no denying that. But it came at a cost. The careful equilibrium Cyrus had built now trembled. And in the space between order and chaos, a new power would rise. The empire trembled. The throne of Persia, once a seat of unquestioned authority, now sat under the weight of confusion and whispers. Who ruled? Was it Berdia, risen from the dead? Or was it an impostor? And if so, how could an empire so vast, so proud, fall for a lie? Enter Darius. Not a direct heir to Cyrus, not a prince, not even the most obvious choice. He was a nobleman, yes, of the Achaemenid bloodline distantly. But what made Darius dangerous wasn't his lineage. It was his clarity. In a time of uncertainty, he knew exactly what he needed to do. The conspirators stormed the palace, killed the false king, and placed Darius on the throne. Whether Gomata truly was an impostor or simply a rival executed in the name of order is still debated. But what matters is this: Darius had seized the moment. The chaos that threatened to shatter the empire became his proving ground. He needed structure, a system that could survive beyond any single ruler. So he began the real work, not of war, but of organization. The King's Eye, they were called. Spies, messengers, troubleshooters. Trust, but verify, that was Darius's way. He improved taxation. Yes, even taxes can be revolutionary, ensuring revenue flowed without crushing the people. And perhaps most impressive of all, he ordered the construction of the Royal Road, stretching over 1,500 miles from Susa to Sardis. Couriers could cross the empire in mere days. There is nothing in the world that travels faster than these Persian messengers, Herodotus marveled. The Persian postal system was born centuries ahead of its time. Darius had served as a spear-bearer for Cambyses, a trusted soldier, a quiet observer. Carved into the mountainside, adorned with sweeping columns and reliefs of tribute-bearing nations, it whispered one message: this is the center of the world. But now, the empire needed more than muscle. It needed a mind willing to act. Under Darius, the empire was also a place of ideas. He left behind not just laws and palaces, but a blueprint for how empires could function beyond swords and banners. He championed Zoroastrianism, the ancient religion of Persia that emphasized the struggle between good and evil, light and darkness. Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, stood at the center. It was not a religion of coercion, but of order, of truth. The empire itself became a reflection of these values, diverse but unified, grand but governed. He did not come alone. With the help of 6 other nobles, Darius conspired against the supposed Bardia. According to Darius' own account immortalized in the towering Behistun inscription carved into the face of a cliff, he uncovered the truth. The man on the throne was a Magian priest named Gomata, pretending to be Cambyses' brother. In 498 BC, they revolted. The Ionian revolt wasn't massive in scale, but it was loud and symbolic. Supported by Athens and Eretria, the Greeks burned Sardis. Darius was enraged, not just by the attack, but by the audacity. From Babylon to Bactria, satraps and rebels rose, claiming independence, calling themselves kings. 9 rebellions in 1 year. 9. For most rulers, this would have been the end. But Darius was not most rulers. It's a story that reads like a political thriller: stealth, betrayal, and blood. With a military precision that felt more Roman than Persian, he moved from region to region, crushing each rebellion. Babylon rebelled twice. Darius took it back twice. In Elam, rebels tried to reclaim their ancient name. Darius sent them a message carved into stone: "I am king by the will of Ahura Mazda." And he meant it. But taking power is one thing. Holding it is another. Almost immediately, the empire erupted. He struck fast. The Behistun inscription, which tells this story in multiple languages, was more than propaganda. It was a declaration. Persia was not falling. It was rising again. But Darius knew that fear alone could not hold an empire together. He divided the empire into satrapies, provinces governed by local leaders loyal to the crown, but watched closely by imperial agents. He introduced a standardized currency, the gold daric, making trade seamless across vast distances. But Darius didn't just want efficiency, he wanted legacy. He began building a new capital, Persepolis. More than a city, it was a symbol. Yet even as Darius poured his energy into reform, he could not ignore the frontier. One region had never accepted Persian rule, not truly: the Greeks. Their cities along the Ionian coast, once absorbed by Cyrus, had begun to stir. He ordered a servant to whisper in his ear daily, "Master, remember the Athenians." And he did. Darius would go to war. But even then, Persia was no simple war machine. By the end of his reign, Darius had restored the empire, redefined its structure, and reached further than any king before him. He died in 486 BC, having ruled for 36 years. His son Xerxes would inherit a kingdom that spanned continents. But the war Darius began with Greece. That was just beginning. Empires stretch not just across land, but across memory. And by the end of Darius's reign, the Persian Empire was not only the largest the world had ever seen, it had become a presence, a force, a weight pressing on the edge of every map, every shore, every restless city. And to Persia, the Greeks were unruly children, disorganized, quarrelsome, disrespectful. But when those same Greeks helped ignite the Ionian revolt, burning Sardis in defiance of Darius's authority, they stepped across a line. But the West was different. To the Greeks, Persia was a looming shadow, a kingdom of decadence, of tyrants, of soft men carried on golden thrones. It was about making a point. To allow such a provocation to go unanswered would invite others to challenge the crown. Persia's reach was long, but its reputation had to be longer. The King of Kings had not forgotten. Darius's decision to launch an invasion of Greece wasn't just about retribution. In 490 BC, the invasion force set out across the Aegean Sea. It wasn't the full might of Persia, more like a warning shot, a message wrapped in iron. The army landed at Marathon, just a short march from Athens. Expecting the usual resistance, light, scattered, poorly led, they were wrong. A people with no king, no great army, no empire, had stood against Persia and lived. But fate intervened. Rebellions elsewhere flared, and before the campaign could launch, Darius fell ill and died. What met them at Marathon wasn't just a band of defenders. It was a hardened force of Athenians who fought not for empire, but for their city, their home. Against overwhelming odds, they launched a surprise charge that shattered Persian ranks. The battle ended in a humiliating Persian retreat, not simply because of the loss, but because the enemy had dared to win. Darius was stunned. Darius began preparations for a second invasion, one on a scale no Greek city could imagine. His son Xerxes inherited the throne, and with it, his father's unfinished war. If Darius had tried to swat a fly, Xerxes came to crush a nest. Where Darius had been a builder, Xerxes would be a breaker. He was born into majesty, son of a king, heir to a realm that stretched across 3 continents. But even in a palace as grand as Persepolis, no child escapes the shadow of expectations. But Greece was not like the rest of the empire. It was a puzzle that refused to fit. Xerxes knew what lay before him: finish what his father started, make the West kneel, to overwhelm them so completely that the memory of resistance would dissolve like sand in the sea. And so, he began preparing the greatest invasion force the world had ever seen. He was not unprepared. He had watched his father rule. He had studied the administration of satraps, the loyalty of generals, the temperaments of foreign kings. Xerxes' plan was not just to defeat the Greeks, it was to erase their defiance. It was a feat of godlike ambition. The Spartan king Leonidas, with just 300 of his own warriors and a few thousand allies, held the pass for days against a force that outnumbered them beyond comprehension. But the victory was hollow. The Athenians had already fled, evacuating their population to the sea. There, at Salamis, their navy waited. In the tight corridors, their numbers became a weakness. The Greek ships, smaller and more maneuverable, struck with surgical precision. Chaos broke out. Fires lit the water. Screams echoed against the cliffs. The Spartans died to the last man. But their courage lit a fire in Greece. He ordered a bridge to be built across the Hellespont, connecting Asia to Europe, with ships bound together and planks laid atop their backs. But in construction and court politics, Persepolis blossomed into its most radiant form. In the end, Xerxes died not on a battlefield, but behind palace walls, just like many of the kings who came before him. But the man himself seemed to fade wounded, perhaps not by a blade, but by a dream that slipped through his fingers. When a storm destroyed the first attempt, Xerxes reportedly had the waters whipped and chained, more than just symbolism. But at Plataea and Mycale, the Greeks sealed their defiance in blood. And while the empire would continue richer, wiser, still powerful, its golden age had peaked. The Persian forces were pushed back, and the great invasion failed. From Bactria to Babylon, from Egypt to the Indus, they came. Tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands. No one knows the true number. What we know is this: it was a moving city of soldiers, engineers, craftsmen, and beasts of burden. Armies didn't just march, they reshaped the land they crossed. It was a declaration that even nature would not defy him. From every corner of the empire, men were summoned, and Greece braced itself. In 480 BC, the Persians arrived. At Thermopylae, narrow mountain pass where the Greek coalition made their stands, Xerxes met his first real resistance. What happened there is legend. Xerxes pushed forward, burning Athens to the ground in a show of dominance. Xerxes, eager to finish the job, ordered his massive fleet into the narrow straits. But the Persians were not fighting on open water. Xerxes watched from a golden throne on shore as his fleet shattered below him. The King of Kings had been humbled. Fearing supply issues and potential rebellion back home, Xerxes retreated, leaving a portion of his army to continue the campaign. Xerxes returned to Persia a different man. In the following years, his energy shifted. The rest of his reign was spent not in war. In 465 BC, he was assassinated. The details are murky. Some say it was a court conspiracy. Others whisper of betrayal from those closest to him. His failure in Greece did not destroy the Persian Empire, but it cracked its armor. The illusion of invincibility was gone. The God King had dared Greece. and Greece had survived. Empires do not fall in a single day. They fade, slowly, quietly, like a sunset that forgets to rise again. After the crushing blow in Greece, the Persian Empire still stood. Its borders remained vast, its wealth unrivaled. But something had changed. Not in the maps, but in the minds. His son, Artaxerxes I, took the throne, inheriting a kingdom still strong, but increasingly unstable. He was a capable ruler, measured, diplomatic, but he ruled in a time of growing whispers. But each reign grew thinner, more ceremonial. They were not empire builders. He reconquered Egypt, restored some order, and cracked down on rebellious satraps. Still enormous, still wealthy, but tired. But that glimmer vanished as quickly as it came. His assassination by his own vizier plunged the empire back into darkness. They were empire sustainers, caretakers of a structure too massive to fully control and too fragile to fully abandon. The satraps, once mere governors, began to see themselves as kings in all but name. Power, once centralized, began to thin and spread like ink in water. The myth of Persian invincibility, once feared from the Nile to the Indus, had been pierced, and in its place crept doubt. Xerxes was gone, murdered by those closest to him. Across the empire, local rulers grew bolder. Rebellions in Egypt flared more frequently. Tax collection became harder. Corruption crept in at every level of administration. The system Darius had built so brilliant, so ahead of its time, was now weighed down by complacency and mistrust. Every succession brought blood. Every coronation was haunted by the ghost of the last king's betrayal. Trust was a memory. The Delian League, led by Athens, began to take control of the Aegean Sea, pushing back against Persian influence in Ionia. The empire's fleet, once feared, now met defeats at Eurymedon and Cnidus battles that chipped away at the maritime edge Persia once held. Meanwhile, the Greeks, once an annoyance on the edge of the empire, had become a genuine threat. Internally, things were no better. The royal court became a nest of intrigues, brothers killing brothers, sons turning against fathers, generals whispering in the dark. And yet, through it all, the empire survived. Artaxerxes II, Artaxerxes III, Darius III, they all ruled for years, even decades. By the time of Artaxerxes III, even the glimmer of revival seemed possible. Now, the empire was tired. And in that fatigue, it missed something. To the west, a storm was forming. A new power, lean and hungry, was growing under a young, restless king with golden hair and eyes fixed eastward. His name was Alexander. By the mid-4th century BC, the Persian Empire was a sleeping giant. Still immense, still gilded in gold and incense, its palaces still rang with the sounds of courtiers and foreign envoys. But beneath the surface, the pulse had slowed. He had not been born to rule, but had been thrust forward by the desperate machinations of a crumbling court. His early reign was dominated not by vision, but by survival. Plots bloomed like weeds in the royal gardens. His advisors were not statesmen, they were vipers, each with their own agenda. The fire that had once driven Cyrus across deserts and inspired Darius to shape a superpower, it flickered now, unsteady, ghostly. On the throne sat Darius III, a king of noble blood, yet unprepared for what lay ahead. And then came the whisper. From the west, a boy king from Macedon had crossed the Hellespont. A minor skirmish, they said, an ambitious child playing war. Persia had seen worse. But what they did not yet see, what they could not see, was that this boy was no ordinary conqueror. He was Alexander. The Persian lines fractured, chaos spread. Darius once again fled the field, leaving behind his chariot, his treasury. Even his family, young, brilliant, restless, He carried with him not just a sword, but a storm. Where others marched, he raced. Where others planned, he struck. His armies were smaller, leaner, hungrier. Darius was not present, but his satraps were. They expected an easy kill. Even Persepolis, the heart of Persian identity, stood defenseless. And when Alexander marched into its great halls, those halls where kings once held audiences beneath ceilings of carved cedar and gold, he wept. Instead, they were crushed. Alexander's cavalry moved like lightning. His infantry locked shields and didn't blink. The Persians fell back, stunned. One of them, Bessus, a fellow noble, turned on Darius, capturing and later murdering him in the mountains of Ecbatana. He had studied the mistakes of Xerxes. He knew where the empire's edges were soft, where its pride had grown fat. They devoured what remained of Persia's spirit. The light that had once illuminated a world now cast long, flickering shadows. The first blow came at Granicus, near the western edge of Asia Minor. Tens of thousands of soldiers from every corner of the empire, archers from Bactria, chariots from Syria, war elephants from India. The numbers alone should have been enough. A mirror image, almost. A man trapped by his time. Still, Persia had seen defeats before. The real test would come later. But in exhaustion, in betrayal, in silence. At Issus, Darius gathered his full force, perhaps the largest army on earth. But numbers were no longer Persia's advantage. Alexander studied the terrain, baited Darius into a narrow battlefield, then struck with terrifying precision. The image was devastating. The King of Kings running. The empire shuddered. City after city opened its gates. Babylon welcomed Alexander as a liberator. Susa offered tribute. And then, perhaps overcome by wine or vengeance or symbolism, he burned it. The flames consumed more than just wood and stone. Darius III fled eastward, hoping to rally what remained. But the satraps no longer believed. Some defected. Others plotted. No final stand. No heroic last charge. The last true king of the Achaemenids died in exile, betrayed by his own. Alexander pursued the murderers, executing them personally. Not just out of vengeance, but out of respect. He considered Darius a worthy enemy. And with Darius dead, the line of Cyrus was broken. The empire that had once stretched like a golden thread across the world had unraveled, not in fire. Not in a final glorious battle. Empires rise, empires fall. That much is inevitable. But some empires leave behind more than ruins. The Persian Empire, though conquered, was never erased. Alexander may have claimed its throne, burned its palaces, and buried its kings. But Persia's soul was far deeper than any battlefield. Its influence seeped into the world like ink into water, shaping systems, thoughts, and cultures long after its final banner fell. With provinces, satraps, standardized currency, postal roads, and official languages, they created the first truly bureaucratic multicultural empire. And future Islamic and European empires would borrow liberally from this playbook. Start with administration. Before Persia, rule was personal kings managing their kingdoms like family estates. But Cyrus, Darius, and their successors built something else entirely, a system. Heaven, hell, judgment, and free will. These were radical concepts for their time, and they would ripple through Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, reshaping how humanity thought about divinity and destiny. Their model didn't just govern lands, it showed the world how an empire could function across continents. The Greeks took notes. The Romans adopted and refined it. Then there was the matter of belief. Because even he, the conqueror, recognized the weight of what he had absorbed. And though centuries apart, each one looked back to Cyrus, Darius, and the Achaemenids for inspiration, not just in power, but in principle. Zoroastrianism, the ancient religion of the Persians, may not be widely practiced today, but its ideas have echoed across centuries. A single, supreme deity. The eternal struggle between good and evil. Aramaic, adopted as an official language, would become the lingua franca of much of the ancient world, paving the way for smoother trade, communication, and administration across cultures. It was, in many ways, the first global language. And culture? Persian art was subtle and powerful reliefs at Persepolis, showing not slaves bowing in fear, but ambassadors offering gifts. A visual language of respect, diplomacy, and diversity. Their architecture blended harmony and grandeur, their palaces designed not just to impress, but to reflect order and peace. Even in language, Persia left its mark. And perhaps most importantly, the idea of Persia survived. Alexander tried to merge Greek and Persian cultures, not erase one with the other. He took Persian wives, wore Persian robes, studied Zoroastrian customs. Later, new Persian empires would rise from the ashes: the Parthians, the Sasanians, the Safavids. Persia had shown the world a different way to rule, through tolerance, through respect, through vision. So yes, the Persian Empire fell, its kings were killed, its cities sacked, its borders redrawn, but the idea of Persia never died. If you walk the ruins of Persepolis today, you can still feel it. The wind moves differently there, soft, reverent, like it knows it's passing through a memory. Columns rise like ribs from the earth, fractured but defiant. Reliefs etched into stone still show the faces of men who have not drawn breath in 2,000 years, ambassadors, nobles, kings. Not in war, but in unity. It was an idea crafted in deserts and mountains, refined in fire and faith, preserved in the memory of those who came after. It showed the world that greatness doesn't always wear a crown of conquest. Sometimes it wears restraint, wisdom, dignity. The empire is gone, but the echo remains. Because Persia was never just palaces or soldiers or kings. Cyrus the Great's decree, etched into the Cyrus cylinder, wasn't meant for just Babylon, it was meant for history. A proclamation of human dignity, of the rights of the conquered, of the ruler's responsibility to his people. It was radical. It was ancient, and yet it feels eerily modern. He married into Persian nobility. He adopted their dress. He bowed in the Persian way. Because he understood something most invaders miss. You can topple a throne, but you can't kill an idea. You hear it in the philosophies passed down through prophets and poets. You feel it in the modern state of Iran, whose very name is rooted in this ancient legacy. And you find it in the quiet awe that descends when standing before a crumbling pillar in Pasargadae or walking the silent halls of Susa and Darius. His Behistun inscription, carved high into a cliff where only the gods might read it, still stands a blend of autobiography, theology, and statcraft. A monument not to ego, but to order. It speaks of rebellion, justice, divine right, but also of the fragility of power. How quickly it can slip, how easily it can break. Even Alexander the Great, the so-called conqueror of Persia, didn't try to erase what he had overthrown. And the idea of Persia still breathes. And though its kings are gone, and its armies long turned to dust, the sound of their footsteps still lingers. You see it in the architecture of distant lands. It whispers, "We were here. We built something. We mattered." Not every empire earns that kind of remembrance. Rome burned. Babylon vanished. But Persia became eternal, not in conquest, in influence, not in fear, in legacy. So the next time you hear the word empire, remember this. Before Rome, before Caesar, before crowns and crosses carved into stone, there was Persia.